I wasn't supposed to be back until next Friday. The sun was still low, the sky painted in soft orange, when my car rolled into the driveway of my mansion. The plan was simple: surprise my daughter with a weekend together before she left for college. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something wrong. My front gate was wide open, my flower beds trampled, and there was an unfamiliar car parked in my driveway. My heart started pounding, that instinctive, sick feeling crawling in my gut. I grabbed my phone and started recording, just in case. What I didn't know was that the next few minutes would change how I saw my home, my neighbors, and my trust forever. I slipped my key into the front door, expecting the satisfying click of my lock turning. Instead, it was already unlocked. My pulse raced faster. I pushed the door open and froze. My living room looked lived in, and not by me. The TV was on, a blanket draped over the couch like someone had just left. The smell of perfume, strong and sweet, hung in the air, completely foreign to me. My footsteps were slow, cautious, my ears straining for any sound. Then I heard laughter from upstairs, female laughter. My grip on my phone tightened. I took each step up the staircase as silently as possible, my heart slamming against my ribs. When I reached the hallway, the door to my master bedroom was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. Standing there, wearing one of my expensive silk robes, holding a glass of my wine, was Karen, HOA president. The woman who lived 3 houses down. The woman who had spent the last year nitpicking every detail of my property, from the shade of my curtains to the type of flowers I planted. And now, she was standing in my bedroom. For a second, she looked shocked, like a kid caught with her hand in the cookie jar. But then, her face shifted into something cold, calculated. "What are you doing here?" she asked, like I was the intruder. I couldn't even process her audacity. "What am I?" "This is my house, Karen," I barked. She tilted her head, almost smirking. "Not for the next 2 weeks, it isn't." I blinked, trying to make sense of her words. 2 weeks. She explained casually, as if this was the most normal thing in the world that she had arranged. For emergency occupancy after claiming my home was unfit due to a so-called HOA violation. She claimed she had authority to temporarily take over until the issue was resolved. My mind spun. This was my private property. She had no legal right. But before I could even call her bluff, she snatched her phone and dialed 911. "Yes," she said sweetly into the receiver. "There's a man in my home. He's trespassing." In that moment, I understood exactly what game she was playing. She wanted me to look like the criminal, and the sick part. I could hear in her voice that she had done this before. Maybe not with me, but with someone else. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with rage. I told her I had everything on camera, but she just smiled and said, "Evidence can be misplaced." Within 10 minutes, I heard the wail of sirens approaching. 2 patrol cars pulled into my driveway, lights flashing. The officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters. Karen rushed to the door before I could say a word. "Thank goodness you're here," she cried dramatically. "This man broke in while I was alone. I'm terrified." She even pretended to wipe a tear. My stomach churned. I started explaining to the officers that I was the owner, that I'd been away for work, but Karen interrupted at every turn. She even produced a stack of temporary occupancy papers with an HOA letterhead. They looked real enough to make one of the officers glance at me suspiciously. I pulled out my phone, showing them my ID, my property deed, my flight tickets, and the security footage of me locking the house before leaving. But Karen was clever. She twisted everything, claiming I'd given her permission before changing my mind, and that she'd moved in to protect the property from vandalism. It was an Oscar-worthy performance, and I could see the officers were confused. One of them suggested we sort it out civilly instead of making arrests. My blood boiled. This was my home, my sanctuary. And she had been living in it for days, maybe longer, eating my food, wearing my clothes, sleeping in my bed as the officers left. One of them gave me a quiet look that said, "Be careful." Karen stood in the doorway, smug as ever, holding the robe closed like she owned the place. "You should come back in 2 weeks," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You'll thank me for keeping it safe." She closed the door right in my face. I stood in my own driveway, staring at my locked front door, my hands shaking with fury. She thought she'd won. She thought I'd just walk away. But she didn't know me. She didn't know what I was capable of when someone crossed the line. And she definitely didn't know that. I was about to turn her little game into the worst mistake she had ever made. The drive back to my hotel that night felt like a blur. I couldn't even remember the turns. I took just the pounding in my head. My mansion, my father's pride and joy. The home I had poured years of work into was now a playground for a woman who had spent months treating me like a nuisance. Every memory in that house felt contaminated now. I thought of my daughters. Laughter in the living room, my late wife's favorite chair by the window, the photo albums stacked neatly in my study. The idea of Karen touching any of it made my stomach twist. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smug face. Standing in my doorway in my robe, holding my glass of wine like she owned it. And the worst part, she wasn't scared of me. She was sure the HOA rules and her fake paperwork could shield her. That confidence meant one thing. She had either done this before or had someone on the inside backing her. I needed to know. Which the next morning, I made my first call to my lawyer. Anthony, a man who had been in my corner for 15 years and knew how to tear apart HOA nonsense. But even he was cautious. "These HOA cases can get messy," he said. "She's got paperwork, even fake. It can buy her time in court. We have to be smart. No breaking in, no threats. You do that, you give her exactly what she wants." I hated hearing that. Waiting wasn't in my nature. But Anthony was right. If I stormed back in, she could twist it into something worse. So instead, I started digging. I went to the HOA office, pretending I needed clarification about some recent changes. The secretary, a nervous young guy who clearly didn't have Karen's arrogance, spilled more than he realized. "Yeah, Karen's been bragging about how she's handling your place. Says it's an example for the neighborhood." He chuckled, but my fists clenched. "An example of what?" I asked. He shrugged. "She said you left your property non-compliant and that the board had to step in." He even leaned in and whispered, "Between you and me, I think she just likes the house." That was my confirmation. This wasn't about rules. It was about greed and probably ego. She had seen my house, seen the way it stood out among the cookie-cutter homes around us, and decided she wanted it for herself, even if just for a While I also found out something even more interesting. Karen's own house was under major renovations. Roof stripped, kitchen gutted, which meant she wasn't just squatting in mine for fun. She was living there out of convenience. That's when the first layer of my plan formed. If Karen wanted to play the legal game, I'd make sure she regretted it. I hired a private investigator, Mark, someone Anthony had worked with before. Mark was the kind of man who could find out what brand of coffee you drank 10 years. "I'll go if you gave him a day." I told him I wanted everything on Karen. Her history, finances, prior HOA disputes. Even dirt on the board members who might be covering for her. He grinned and said, "Give me 48 hours. While Mark worked, I started setting my own traps. I called the utilities company and reported suspicious activity at my address. I couldn't shut the power or water off. That could look like harassment. But I could have them run emergency checks that would be inconvenient. I also made sure the security cameras I'd hidden in the garage and backyard were feeding live to my cloud. Karen had no idea those existed. Every hour, I'd check in, and sure enough, I caught her sunbathing by my pool, hosting a wine night with her friends, and even letting her little dog tear up my rose garden. 2 nights later, Mark called. "You're going to love this," he said. He had dug up 3 prior complaints filed against Karen in other neighborhoods she'd lived in, all involving temporary occupancy disputes. She'd been fined twice, but both times she'd avoided serious punishment by claiming miscommunication or blaming someone else. Even better, Mark discovered she was already behind on her mortgage by a lot, which meant she wasn't just arrogant, she was desperate. That desperation was my key. I knew exactly how to push her into making a mistake big enough to destroy her, but it had to be slow, methodical. I needed her comfortable, overconfident, and unaware that the ground beneath her was crumbling. The next step was bait. I called one of my contractor friends and asked him to inspect my property for an urgent but fake city permit issue. The goal? To get him inside while I recorded everything. Her reaction, her refusal to leave, her admitting she was in charge. He showed up that afternoon, wearing a neon vest and carrying a clipboard. I watched the footage later, my jaw tightening as I saw Karen wave him off like some queen. "You'll have to talk to me," she told him. "I'm the current resident. The owner isn't here." The arrogance in her voice was perfect, exactly what I needed in court. That night, I drove past the house, staying far enough not to be noticed. Lights blazed in every room. Music drifted through the open windows. My mansion had become her palace. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was patient. Every queen eventually overplays her hand. And when she did, I'd be waiting with everything. I needed to take her down. What I didn't know yet was that she was already planning her next move. And it was about to cross a line so personal, so unforgivable, that my revenge would turn from strategic to merciless. I woke up to my phone buzzing at 6:12 a.m. It was Mark, the private investigator. "You're going to want to check your cameras right now," he said, his voice unusually urgent. I rolled over, opened the feed, and my blood went ice cold. Aren wasn't alone in my home anymore. On the screen, a tall man in his 40s was carrying boxes into my living room, boxes full of clothes, tools, and personal items. He wasn't a repairman. He wasn't a guest. He was moving in. Behind him, Karen strutted around, directing him where to put things, like some twisted version of a homemaker. My furniture was being rearranged, my artwork taken down and replaced, with tacky framed prints I'd never seen before. This wasn't temporary occupancy anymore. This was a hostile takeover. I clenched my jaw, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But then I froze the frame and zoomed in on one of the boxes. It had a label S. Winters, the last name sounded familiar. Mark must have sensed my confusion. "That's Stephen Winters," he said, "Karen's brother. Fresh out of a messy divorce. No job. Guess who's his free housing solution?" It hit me like a punch. She wasn't just squatting. She was turning my mansion into her family's crash pad. And that meant my private space, my bedroom, my study, my daughters. Room were all fair game for them. My stomach twisted at the thought of strangers rifling through our personal belongings. That was the moment it stopped being just a legal battle. This was personal war. I called my lawyer Anthony again, updating him on the new footage. His voice was sharp. "Good. This helps us. Multiple unauthorized occupants means more liability. Keep recording. Don't confront them yet." But patience felt like swallowing glass. I wanted them gone. Now, later that afternoon, Mark sent me another update and this one nearly broke me. He'd spotted Karen and Stephen leaving my house carrying a box of my late wife's things. A quilt her grandmother had sewn, a hand-painted vase we'd bought on our honeymoon. They loaded it into Karen's SUV like it was theirs. I sat there staring at the still image, my hands trembling, my vision blurring with fury. That quilt wasn't just fabric, it was a piece of my wife, the woman I'd buried 5 years ago, and Karen was stealing it. I didn't call the cops, not yet. I wanted her so tangled in her lies, so deep in her theft, that when I pulled the rug out, she'd have nowhere to land. 2 nights later, I drove past the house again. This time, the smell of barbecue drifted through the air. Laughter spilled from the backyard. I parked down the street and slipped into the shadows, peering through the fence. My jaw dropped. She'd invited over nearly a dozen people. They were drinking, blasting music, splashing in my pool. Stephen was flipping burgers like he owned the place. And Karen was parading around with a glass of wine, introducing herself as the current resident. Every laugh, every clink of glasses felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But then I noticed something that made my lips curl into a cold smile. Stephen was bragging about how lucky they were to have found a free mansion thanks to Karen's HOA position. 2 guests laughed and told him, "Just don't get caught." And he said, loud enough for my camera's mic to catch, "Don't worry, the real owner's too scared to do anything." That was it. That was the arrogance I needed. That single line would be the nail in their coffin. The next morning, I called in a favor from a friend who worked in local media. I told her the whole story, sent her the footage, and asked if she wanted an exclusive on HOA abuse. Her eyes lit up. "Are you kidding? This is gold." She promised to handle it carefully. No leaks until I gave the go-ahead. Meanwhile, Mark found even more dirt. Stephen had 2 outstanding warrants for unpaid fines, and Karen had lied on multiple HOA forms. She wasn't just arrogant. She was reckless. I could almost hear the walls closing in around her. But then, something happened that made me realize Karen was about to push me over the edge. When I checked the cameras that night, I saw her walking into my daughter's bedroom. She opened drawers, rifled through her clothes, even picked up her framed graduation photo and set it on the desk, next to an open bottle of wine and 2 glasses. My chest tightened. That room was sacred. It wasn't just my daughter's space. It was the last untouched part of our life before my wife passed. That was the moment I knew I wouldn't just evict her. I'd ruin her. I'd take her position, her reputation, and her pride. And when I was done, she'd never look at another person's home without remembering the day she lost everything. I started setting the final stage. This wasn't just going to be legal revenge. This was going to be public humiliation. What I didn't know yet was that she had one last stunt planned, and it would make everything explode much sooner than I'd anticipated. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, just 3 days after I'd decided to dismantle Karen's life, piece by piece. I was sitting in the hotel lounge, going through Mark's latest findings, when my phone pinged with a motion alert from the backyard camera. I opened the feed, and my blood ran cold. Karen was walking across my lawn with a man in a suit, a realtor. They were talking, laughing, pointing at the pool, the garden, the house itself. The man carried a folder under his arm, flipping through pages as she gestured like she was giving him a tour at first. I thought maybe she was joking, showing off to a friend. But then I caught a snippet of their conversation as they came closer to the mic. "So we're thinking we can list it for around 2.3. The realtor said Karen smiled like a cat who had already eaten the canary. "Perfect. And I want it sold within the month. I've already lined up a new place." I nearly dropped my phone. She was trying to sell my house, my home, without my knowledge, without my consent, without a single legal right to do so. My hands shook so badly I had to set the phone down before I cracked the screen. I called Mark immediately. He didn't even let me finish. Get her on tape saying that. That's criminal fraud. You'll have her in handcuffs within a week. So I waited, watching the feed as Karen led the realtor inside, bragging about her renovations and the exclusive neighborhood. She even walked him into my study, pointing out her office. I was gritting my teeth so hard my jaw ached, but then jackpot. The realtor asked about the title, if it was under her name. And she said, without hesitation, it's in transition. The owner's gone, won't be back for weeks. Paperwork's in progress. That was all I needed. I clipped the video, saved it in 3 different locations, and sent it to Anthony. His reply was instant. This is it. This is the kill shot. Still, I wasn't going to jump too soon. I wanted her thinking she was untouchable. So I called my media contact again. Get your camera crew ready. I want this on the 6 o'clock news when the cuffs go on. She laughed, almost giddy. You're about to make HOA history. Over. The next 2 days, Karen doubled down. She brought in a stager, someone to rearrange my furniture, cover my walls with neutral art, even remove my personal photos. I watched in silence as my home turned into a generic showroom, my life erased, piece by piece. And the worst part, she looked happy, relaxed, like she'd already won. But arrogance has a way of making people sloppy. On Saturday night, she threw what she called a farewell party for her friends. I know this because the cameras caught her literally giving a speech in my backyard. This house has been my sanctuary, she said, wine glass in hand. And soon, it's going to fund my new life. Her friends cheered. Stephen grilled steaks. And I sat in my hotel room, every muscle tense, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came sooner than expected. The next morning, I got a call from my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a sweet older lady who'd always kept an eye on my place. Honey, she said, in a worried tone, I just saw Karen loading a moving truck. She's taking things out of your house furniture. Boxes, electronics. It's almost like she's emptying the place. That was it. The line she'd just crossed wasn't just legal. It was personal theft. I called Anthony and told him it was time. He contacted the police, armed them with the footage, the fraudulent sale attempt, the unauthorized occupancy, and the moving truck full of stolen goods. Then, I made one final call to my media contact. Be at my address in 1 hour, I said. You're going to get your story. I drove to the house, parking far enough away to watch it all unfold. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear. Anymore, it was anticipation. I saw the police cars arrive first, blocking the driveway. Karen stepped out, clearly annoyed, her hand on her hip as she talked to an officer. Stephen appeared at the door, confused, holding a box of my silverware. Then, the moment I'd been waiting for. One officer read her rights while another began loading the moving truck inventory into an evidence log. The news van pulled up just in time to capture Karen's expression shift from smug to stunned. As they placed her in handcuffs, I walked up slowly, letting her see me. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked afraid. I leaned in just enough for her to hear me over the chaos. You should have picked a different house. The cameras caught every second. The HOA president being led away, the stolen property laid out on my lawn, the moving truck full of my things. It was beautiful. But this wasn't over. Because while Karen was headed to jail, the HOA itself had been part of this scheme. And I wasn't about to let them walk away clean by the time Karen was booked into the county jail. The footage had already gone viral. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages, neighbors, old friends, even strangers sending me links to news clips. Headlines screamed things like, HOA president Arrested for squatting in neighbor's mansion and caught on camera. Woman tries to sell home she doesn't own. I thought the worst was over. But Anthony called me that night, his voice sharp. Don't celebrate yet. The HOA is going to try to distance themselves from her, and if they do, she might just throw them under the bus. We need to hit them before they hit us. That was when I realized this wasn't just about Karen. The HOA board had known she was in my house. Maybe not the full extent of her scam, but they'd given her enough cover to make it possible. Without their backing, her fake emergency occupancy papers would have been laughed out of existence. I dug out every letter, every petty violation notice Karen had sent me over the past year. The dates, the language, all of it pointed to a pattern of harassment. I gave it to Anthony, and he started building a civil suit, not just against Karen, but against the HOA itself. We're talking damages for trespass, emotional distress, theft, and defamation, he said. If we play this right, we'll bankrupt them. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to save face. They sent out a neighborhood-wide email claiming Karen had acted alone and that they were shocked by her behavior. But Mark wasn't done digging. He found emails between Karen and 2 other board members. Emails where they discussed temporarily reassigning my home during my absence. One even joked, "Hey, maybe we should all take turns." When Anthony saw those, his eyes lit up. This is conspiracy, plain and simple. I didn't want just a court battle. I wanted public humiliation, the kind they couldn't scrub away with a PR statement. So I went back to my media contact. "You want part 2 of your story?" I asked her. This time, we talk about the HOA's role. The next evening, she aired an exclusive follow-up segment. The leaked emails flashed across the screen, names and titles clearly visible. Neighbors who had stayed silent during Karen's reign started speaking out. They talked about petty fines, intimidation tactics, and bogus rules. The HOA's pristine image shattered overnight. That's when the board members panicked. I got a call from the HOA's attorney asking for a private discussion to resolve matters without dragging this out. Translation: they were desperate to settle before more dirt came out. I agreed to meet, but not alone. Anthony came with me, and so did Mark, quietly recording from the corner. The meeting was held in the HOA's stuffy little office. The board members looked pale, exhausted, and for the first time, powerless. Their offer was pathetic. Waive my dues for a year and issue a formal apology. I almost laughed. Anthony didn't. He leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "You're looking at a lawsuit that will destroy this HOA. We're talking hundreds of thousands in damages. That apology you're offering, it's not worth the paper it's written on." One of the board members, a wiry man who had been Karen's biggest supporter, tried to bluff. "You'll never win in court." I slid a copy of their emails across the table I already have. They cracked after that. The final settlement wasn't just money, though they did agree to pay me enough to cover my legal fees, the damage to my property, and a hefty sum for my trouble. More importantly, the agreement required the immediate resignation of every single board member and the dissolution of the HOA itself. No more Karen, no more fines, no more petty harassment. Walking out of that office felt better than the day. Karen was arrested. For the first time in years, I had my neighborhood back. My home was mine again, untouchable. But as much as I wanted to close the book, there was one last thing I needed to do. Karen was still sitting in jail, awaiting trial. And I had a choice. Let her serve her sentence quietly, or make sure she never forgot what she'd done. I knew which one I was going to choose. The courthouse was packed the morning of Karen's first hearing. I wasn't required to be there. Anthony could have handled it alone, but I wanted to see her face when she realized exactly how far she had fallen. She came in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. The confident, sharp-tongued HOA president was gone. Her hair was limp, her face pale, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. When they landed on me, I gave her a small, cold smile. She quickly looked away. The prosecutor began laying out the charges: trespassing, theft, attempted fraud, criminal mischief, and conspiracy. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as each accusation was read. Karen's attorney tried to paint her as misguided rather than malicious, but the evidence was too damning. The videos of her giving a tour to the realtor, the audio of her claiming the house was in transition, the footage of her backyard parties. It all played on a large screen for the judge and jury to see. When the clip of her brother bragging about the free mansion came up, I caught a juror shaking his head in disbelief. Then came the part I had been waiting for. My media contact, the same one who had run the news stories, had been subpoenaed as a witness. She confirmed that Karen had willingly spoken to her off-camera before the arrest, boasting about making the place hers and finally living like she deserved. The look on Karen's face in that moment, it was the expression of someone realizing the walls were closing in from every direction. During a recess, I walked past her in the hallway. The guards didn't let her move, but I stopped just close enough to speak quietly. "You remember when you told me to come back in 2 weeks?" I said. "Looks like you'll be coming back in." "Never." She glared, but there was no bite left in it. By the end of the day, the judge denied her bail. The trial was set for a month later, but she'd be sitting in county lockup until then. Anthony leaned over and whispered, "She's going to try to cut a deal. The DA knows you want restitution." And he was right. A week later, her attorney reached out with an offer. She'd pled guilty to the main charges: pay restitution and publicly apologize in exchange for a reduced sentence. A reduced sentence. I almost turned it down. I didn't care about her apology. But then I realized forcing her to admit everything in open court would be the final blow to her ego. The day of the plea hearing, the courtroom was just as full as before. Karen stood there, hands shaking, voice trembling as she read from a prepared statement. She admitted to forging documents, unlawfully occupying my home, attempting to sell it, and stealing my personal property. She even said my name, acknowledging the harm she caused me and my family. Cameras flashed. Every word was recorded, and I knew it would follow her for the rest of her life. When she was done, the judge sentenced her to 3 years, 18 months in prison, the rest on probation. She'd also be paying me a 6-figure sum in restitution, and she was barred from serving on any HOA board ever again. As they led her away, she glanced back at me one last time. I couldn't tell if it was hate or regret in her eyes. Maybe both. But I didn't care. The important thing was that she was gone, and my home was finally safe. After the hearing, I went straight to my house. I walked through every room, breathing in the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh air. The furniture was back where it belonged. The photos rehung my daughter's room untouched once again. But it didn't feel quite the same. Not yet. The scars were still there. That night, sitting on my porch with a glass of bourbon, I thought about everything Karen had taken from me and everything I'd taken back. And I realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure no one else could ever pull something like this again, which meant my work wasn't over.